recording. Okay. We're going to start off where we left off last time, which was we were finishing up the growth hormone. Okay, so let me scroll through my slides here until I get to growth hormone. Just as a sort of a recap to where we are covering, or we began discussing, the hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. And we're starting with growth hormone, and we're starting with prolactin. So we moved from the posterior pituitary gland to the anterior pituitary gland. And just a recap of some of the things that we talked about. One, the anterior pituitary gland produces 6 hormones. 4 of those are tropic hormones, which means that they target other endocrine tissues. All of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland have many things in common. One, they're all secreted in response to hormones from the hypothalamus. 2, they are all non-steroidal hormones, meaning they work through second messengers. 3, they all work through negative feedback. The only ways in which they differ is in what they do and their targets. Okay? Right? So this illustration here shows the 6 hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland in response to hormones from the hypothalamus. Growth hormone and prolactin are the 2 we're going to start with, and then we're going to move on to the tropic hormones, because whenever we're talking about the tropic hormones, we're also going to be talking about the hormones that are produced by their target organs. Okay? So we talked about growth hormone. We talked about the fact that some of the most conspicuous effects of growth hormone are on the bones and muscles. They cause the body to spare protein and carbohydrate at the expense of fat. Growth hormone, we said, increases the long bone growth by increasing the activity of chondroblasts and osteoblasts. And that's why when you hit puberty, you get these growth spurts, because you've got that growth hormone that's increasing the lengthening of your bones. Okay, because bone lengthening is caused by the activity of osteoblasts making new bone, replacing old cartilage, and the chondroblasts, of course, producing new cartilage. And we also talked a little bit about dysfunctions in the output of growth hormone. Not that you have to know these conditions, but I share them with you so that you could understand the effects of growth hormone. We said excessive growth hormone production in youth leads to gigantism, because you have excessive long bone growth. And in an adult, if it occurs, because the growth plates have shut down, you don't get gigantism, but you get what's called acromegaly, because while the bones can't lengthen, they can still widen. And so that's what you see. Hyposecretion, abnormally low secretion of growth hormone, causes pituitary dwarfism, where you have someone with a small body size, but the body is in normal proportions. And this is because there's a generalized decrease in normal bone lengthening and widening. So that's the growth hormone. Lastly is the regulation of growth hormone. And growth hormone is regulated by negative feedback. Now, before you freak out at this image, please understand that you're not going to have to know or regurgitate this image. I want to explain this image because it gives a great illustration of negative feedback. So I'm going to go through this image, and then I'm going to bottom line what you need to know. So growth hormone is regulated by negative feedback. So I said that the hypothalamus, and this is true of all anterior pituitary hormones, the hypothalamus releases hormones which either inhibits or stimulates the release of growth hormone from the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus releases what are called growth inhibiting factors, which stop the release of growth hormone, and growth releasing factors, which increases. So you can sort of think of it as like the brake and the gas on the pituitary for the release of growth hormone. Okay. In response to these releasing factors from the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, anti-pituitary gland, produces growth hormone. That growth hormone then targets body tissues, and those body tissues respond by making what are called insulin-like growth factors. Don't worry about what they are, but they produce insulin-like growth factors. So as growth hormone levels in the blood increase, IGFs increase. Those IGFs have effects, but they also inhibit further secretion of growth hormone. So this is negative feedback onto the pituitary gland, anti-pituitary gland. Those IGFs also inhibit further release of growth releasing factors from the hypothalamus, and growth hormone itself inhibits further release of these growth releasing factors. Okay, so you have what's sometimes referred to as, like when I was in grad school anyway, we referred to this as short loop negative feedback, and then you had long loop negative feedback, right? But all this is negative feedback, meaning that as growth hormone levels rise, they inhibit further secretion of growth hormone. That's what makes it negative feedback. I share this with you because it's a great illustration of negative feedback. Okay, so that is growth hormone. Now let's move into prolactin, the other non-tropic hormone produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Now just think about the name, prolactin. When you think of lactin, you think of what? Lactation, maybe? Milk? And indeed, that is one of its main effects. Prolactin stimulates and maintains milk production following childbirth. It also temporarily stops ovulation, following childbirth. So notice that both of these are effects in women. What about effects in men? Well, we really don't know what the effects are in men, or at least the last time I did a little research, we didn't. But what we do know is if there is excessive production of prolactin, it causes erectile dysfunction. Okay, so we're going to move from the non-tropic hormones of the anterior pituitary gland to the tropic hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. For each of these hormones we're going to cover, you have to know the organ that releases it, where that organ is located, its target tissue, its stimulation of secretion, its effects, chemistry and mechanism of action, as well as its regulation of secretion. And recall, I emailed you the tables where you could list this information and study it. Alrighty, so the first tropic hormone we're going to talk about is thyroid stimulating hormone. And as we're talking about thyroid stimulating hormone, we're also going to talk about the thyroid hormones T3 and T4, and we're going to explain what causes the development of a goiter or an enlargement of the thyroid gland. Alrighty, so we're moving now to talk about the tropic hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland in response to hormones from the hypothalamus. If you recall, tropic hormones are hormones that target other endocrine organs. We're starting with thyrotropic hormone, also known as thyroid stimulating hormone, and its name literally tells you what it does. So the thyroid gland excuse me, The hypothalamus produces a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. You don't have to know that, but it produces a hormone that causes the anterior pituitary gland to then release thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone, as its name implies, targets the thyroid gland. And what does it do? It stimulates the thyroid gland to grow and to secrete thyroid hormones. Now let's talk a little bit about the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is relatively easy to find on your own body. This piece of cartilage, the largest piece of cartilage in your neck, is called the thyroid cartilage. It's named after the thyroid gland. The thyroid cartilage, by the way, is your Adam's apple, right? Or at least the anterior surface of it. So you can find your Adam's apple and then just go right below it and you'll find the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland it's sort of shaped like, well, Madison. You've got the isthmus here in the middle, right? So this is downtown, right? And then you got the west side and you got the east side. The thyroid gland produces two types of hormones. It produces the hormones that we typically refer to as thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment. And it produces the hormone calcitonin. So the thyroid gland actually produces three hormones. But when you hear the term thyroid hormones, we're really only referring to T3 and T4. And T3 and T4 are the hormones that the thyroid gland produces in response to thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone has no effect on calcitonin. So let's talk now about these thyroid hormones T3 and T4. Well, what does T3 and T4 actually, mean? Why do we call them that? Well, thyroxine, or T4, is so named because every molecule of this amine, it's a modified amino acid, has 4 iodine atoms. So we refer to it as T4. T3, or triiodothyronine, has 3 atoms of iodine in every molecule. And in fact, most of the iodine in your body is found in your thyroid gland. And because the thyroid hormones are composed of iodine, that is principally why iodine is a required nutrient. If you don't have enough iodine, your thyroid gland can't produce sufficient amounts of the thyroid hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. So what are the effects of the thyroid hormones? They are major metabolic hormones. They control the rate at which glucose is iodized and converted to body heat and energy. For your cells to utilize glucose to produce ATP, there has to be sufficient levels of those thyroid hormones being produced. In terms of their target cells, well, thyroid hormones target every cell of the body. Okay, every cell of the body is targeted by thyroid hormones. Every cell has thyroid hormone receptors. Thyroid hormone is absolutely essential for normal tissue growth and development, especially those tissues that grow and develop over long periods of time, like the reproductive system and the nervous systems. In juveniles, if they have severe hypothyroidism, where that is they don't have sufficient amounts of thyroid hormone being produced, you'll actually see a nervous system that never fully develops, where the individual can be developmentally disabled, and where the reproductive system never fully develops. Now, how is thyroid hormone regulated? Well, it's regulated by negative feedback. The hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4. As the T3 and T4 levels in the blood rise, they feed back onto the pituitary gland, decreasing further release of TSH. And they also feed back onto the hypothalamus, inhibiting the release of hormones that stimulate the release of TSH. So again, you have this short loop negative feedback, and you have this long loop negative feedback. Now I have a question for you, or I will in a second. In individuals that have an iodine deficiency, that is, they don't have sufficient amounts of iodine in their diets, we see an enlargement of the thyroid gland, and that is called a goiter. So this is hypothyroidism. It's iodine deficiency hypothyroidism. The reason why that the thyroid hormone levels are low is because the patients or individuals not getting sufficient amounts of iodine. So the question I have for you is, why would the thyroid gland enlarge if there wasn't sufficient amounts of iodine in the diet? So I want you to think about that for a moment, and I want you to think about it in the context of this image here illustrating negative feedback. Okay, why would it be that if you're not getting sufficient amounts of iodine and therefore not producing sufficient amounts of T3 and T4, that the thyroid gland would enlarge? Any thoughts? If anyone would like to. Does it get filled up with TSH? Oh, you are very close. Okay, so Don says it's going to enlarge to produce more T3. Correct. Emily adds, the feedback keeps telling it to make more T3 and T4, right? And associated with that is enlargement. So basically, if there is no T3 and T4, or if there's low levels of T3 and T4, you're not getting inhibition. You're not getting feedback onto the anterior pituitary gland. You're not getting feedback onto the hypothalamus. And so what you continue to get is the anterior pituitary gland sending more thyroid stimulating hormone to the thyroid, right? Saying, make more, grow bigger, make more. The thyroid gland enlarges, but it can't make any more T3 and T4 than it's making because it doesn't have the iodine. It's like a car manufacturing plant enlarging so it can make more cars, but it doesn't have enough tires to make more cars. So we can open a whole new production line. We can make the car production facility bigger, but if you don't have more raw materials, you can't make any more cars. And so that's what's happening. You don't have this negative feedback, so you have high circulating levels of TSH, causing the thyroid gland to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, we don't so much see iodine deficiency anymore. Way back in, I'd say maybe the early 20th century, where we didn't have good refrigeration. There were some parts of the Midwest or the West rather, where you had poor iodine soil, and so you had people that ate plants locally that didn't have a lot of iodine in them, and so and because you didn't have good refrigeration, and they didn't have you didn't have fish and animals that foods that might have a lot of iodine in them brought in to these areas, and so you did see iodine deficiency back then, and that's why salt is iodized with potassium iodate, so that we don't so that even if you are eating locally and everything that you're eating is grown in poorly low iodine soils, you don't get a iodine deficient hypothyroidism. So what you're looking at here is an adult with hypothyroidism, not necessarily caused by iodine, but what you see is someone who is an adult with hypothyroidism here on the left. They will tend to have a low basal metabolic rate. So they will typically be cold all the time because they have a low body temperature. They're not utilizing as much of the energy and the food that they are consuming, so they'll tend to put on weight, have a high amount of fat, and because they're not utilizing energy very well, they will tend to be fatigued. On the left is the patient before treatment for hypothyroidism. Right is after treatment. You can see there's much less fat deposits underneath the skin, for example. Hyperthyroidism is above normal levels of thyroid hormone. Some of the things you see, well, in many ways, you see the exact opposite. You see people they tend to be hot all the time. They tend to have lots of energy and will also tend to to have what's called irritability, and that basically means they are sensitive to stimuli, things that normally would not bother them, sounds or light that normally would not bother them or bother an average person does. They will tend to be hot, have a high blood pressure, insomnia. You'll also get fatty deposits behind the eyes, which tends to the eyes will appear to then bulge forward. That's called oxophthalmy. This particular person has Graves' disease, hyperthyroidism, and that's a situation where your immune system is actually producing an antibody that mimics the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so as we move on to our next hormones, remember this is what you need to know for each hormone. Okay, and again, for all of the anterior pituitary hormones, everything's basically the same except target organ or tissue and stimulation of and its effects. Okay, target organ or tissue and effects. Okay, let's move to the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. And this may sound like a mouthful. Just break it apart. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. The name tells you what it's going to do. Adrenocortico, the adrenal cortex. And of course, it's a tropic hormone because it's targeting another hormone producing gland. Okay, the adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal cortex then releases the hormones aldosterone and the glucocorticoids and even sex hormones, believe it or not. So yes, your adrenal cortex produces some amount of sex hormone. So we're going to talk now about adrenocorticotropic hormone as well as the hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex. Okay, so the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is released by the anterior pituitary gland in response to hormones from the hypothalamus. And the adrenocorticotropic hormone, of course, is going to target the adrenal cortex. What adrenocorticotropic hormone regulates the activity of the adrenal cortex. And in animal research, we use it, or at least when I was in grad school, we used it as a diagnostic for quantifying stress. In human patients that are in a research trial, you can ask someone, like for scale from 1 to 10, how stressed are they, right? 1 being no stress at all, 10 being like as stressed as you could possibly be. In animals, we can't really do that. So we have to have some kind of objective way of doing that. And one of the ways we would do that is we would pull blood and we would measure the levels of ACTH in the blood. And it correlates very well with the stress response that is occurring in an organism or in an animal. So ACTH targets the adrenal cortex. Where is the adrenal cortex located? Well, let's talk about the adrenal glands. So the kidneys wear the adrenal glands like hats. In fact, if we break down the word adrenal, they pretty much tell you where they're located or why they're named the adrenal. Renal refers to kidney. Renal refers to kidney. If we add this gland to the kidney, we get adrenal, right? Therefore, we have the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal gland is one of those organs where, once again, we named it before we really knew what it did, sort of like the pituitary gland. We named it pituitary gland before we had an appreciation that it's really 2 separate organs, differing in anatomy as well as physiology. The adrenal gland really is 2 different organs. The outer portion is the adrenal cortex, and core, whenever you see the word cortex in anatomy, it always refers to the outer portion. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree, which of course is on the very outer surface of a tree. So the adrenal cortex is this outer portion of the adrenal gland. The middle portion is the adrenal medulla. We'll talk about the adrenal medulla later. Right now, we're going to focus on the cortex because it's the adrenal cortex that is targeted by ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. So adrenal corticotropic hormone causes the adrenal cortex to release the corticosteroids. Those corticosteroids include mineralocorticoids, and it's mainly aldosterone that is produced, the glucocorticoids, cortisone and cortisol is the main hormone that's produced, and the sex hormones, okay? The androgens or the male sex hormones specifically. Let's talk about each of these, but notice that the corticosteroids are all steroids. These are all steroids, meaning that they act directly on the DNA of their target cells and tissues. So mineralocorticoids, and again, we're only going to talk about aldosterone. There are several of them, but we're only going to talk about aldosterone. Mineralocorticoids. What does that mean? Mineral. Well, obviously, it's going to regulate the levels of minerals, right, in the blood. Mineralocorticoids. So what does aldosterone do? Well, first of all, it's produced by the adrenal cortex. You know that. What does it do? Well, it regulates the mineral content of blood, specifically water and certain electrolytes, especially sodium and potassium. In fact, those are the only ones that we're going to focus on. Well, what does it do? Well, it targets the kidneys, and it causes the kidneys to retain sodium in the blood at the expense of potassium. So in other words, aldosterone causes a decrease in the loss of sodium in the urine. So it causes sodium in the urine to decrease, and it causes an increase in the loss of potassium in the urine. Aldosterone targets the kidney tubules. This causes sodium retention in the blood at the expense of potassium. And also, when sodium is retained, chloride, which is negatively charged, is retained along with it. So you can sort of think wherever sodium goes, chloride follows. So aldosterone basically causes the body to retain salt. So it causes sodium and chloride to be retained, and because water is a charged molecule, water is retained as well. So the net impact of aldosterone is it causes the kidneys to retain sodium and chloride, salt, and water at the expense of potassium. So potassium levels in the blood drop, sodium chloride levels in the blood increase, and water is retained. So aldosterone also has anti-diuretic effects. This image from your book sort of summarizes what stimulates the production of aldosterone. I want to call your attention to what's highlighted here in purple. Now, if you know what aldosterone does, you understand that aldosterone is regulated by negative feedback, by knowing what it does, you should have an idea of what stimulates it. So aldosterone, produced by the adrenal cortex, causes the kidneys to increase their reabsorption of sodium and water at the expense of potassium. So just thinking of the fact that aldosterone is regulated by negative feedback, that should tell you what stimulates its secretion. If it causes an increase in sodium in the blood and a decrease in potassium, it makes sense that what would cause aldosterone to be secreted would be a decrease in sodium and an increase in potassium. So as sodium levels rise and as sodium levels fall and potassium levels in the blood increase, that causes the secretion of aldosterone. Also, as blood volume and blood pressure fall, that causes the release of aldosterone. Because remember, what does aldosterone do when it targets the kidneys? It causes the kidneys to retain sodium and chloride and water. So it helps maintain blood volume in a similar manner that antidiuretic hormone does. The mechanism is different, but it does work in a similar manner. Okay. Also, stress, just the feeling of being reacting to stressors or changes in your environment, impact the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus causes the anterior pituitary gland to secrete ACTH, and that ACTH causes the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone as well. So we have 3 different stimuli that causes the release of aldosterone, right? One is a neural stimulus, and the other 2 are humoral stimuli. Aldosterone increases blood pressure and blood volume, and therefore is regulated by negative feedback, because as blood volume increases and blood pressure increases, the stimulus that caused it to be secreted in the first place is reduced. So this is classic negative feedback. So that's aldosterone, a mineralocorticoid. Let's talk about the glucocorticoids. And again, these names are very descriptive. Glucocorticoid. It's probably going to have something to do with glucose levels, right? And indeed it does. So the 2 principal glucocorticoids are cortisone and cortisol. And really the principal one is cortisol, I should say. Cortisone and cortisol are produced by the adrenal cortex in response to ACTH. What do? Well, they help maintain blood sugar levels in times of long-term stress. And when we're talking about long-term stress, we're talking about long periods, like days, weeks, possibly months. Let's say you are lost in the woods for like a week and you have barely anything to eat, right? That type of long-term stress. Or you have a major operation where you're in the hospital for a number of days, right? You don't eat normally. Your body is dealing with a lot of trauma that it has to adjust and repair. That type of stress. The glucocorticoids help maintain blood sugar levels during those times of stress to help the body get through those periods, to help the body resist the long-term stressors that are impacting it. Cortisol, as I mentioned, is the main glucocorticoid as opposed to cortisone. What are its effects? How does it help maintain blood sugar levels? Well, it helps break down tissues. It encourages the breakdown of tissues and discourages the deposition of tissues. So in other words, it is very much a catabolic steroid hormone. If you're trying to maintain blood sugar levels, we're not going to be in the position of depositing energy in the form of protein or fat. Instead, the body's going to be breaking down fat and protein if necessary to make glucose and maintain blood sugar levels. So fat's broken down, fatty acids and glycerol, for the production of ATP and for glucose synthesis. Maybe when you're sitting after you've had major surgery, you're not really eating a lot. So to maintain blood sugar levels, your body is utilizing the fat and, if necessary, the protein in your body to make glucose to maintain those blood sugar levels so you can get through this period of stress. Protein is broken down into amino acids, and those amino acids can be used to make glucose. So overall, the glucocorticoids are maintaining blood sugar levels at the expense of other sources of energy, principally fat and, if necessary, protein. So this ensures that in times of fasting, or like if you're lost in the woods for a period of days or weeks, or during illness, that there's sufficient amounts of nutrients for basic processes. Your central nervous system has to have glucose at all times. Your brain doesn't utilize energy to make ATP from protein and fat very well. The glucocorticoids, cortisol in particular, helps ensure that times where you're not getting a carbohydrate in your diet, that your body is able to make its own carbohydrate at the expense of fat and protein. Okay? So the glucocorticoids are hormones of long-term stress. All right, this is not the same as like fight or flight. Fight or flight is like short-term, immediate stress, trying to get away from a lion. This is the stress that will occur if the lion injures you and you have to be hospitalized for a few days, possibly go through a surgery where you lose, a good proportion of your blood, and there's a decent length of a period to recover from your wounds. Okay, that's what we mean by long-term stress as opposed to the fight or flight. So these glucocorticoids are hormones of long-term stress, as I mentioned. Now, some of the things that the glucocorticoids do in addition to maintaining blood glucose levels is they decrease the inflammatory response. They have a negative impact on your immune system. Now, this may seem counterintuitive. Why would you want something to sort of dampen your immune system if you were just involved in like a major surgery? Well, sometimes the response to injury, if it gets out of hand, can be damaging. A little inflammation is okay in response to injury. Too much actually causes additional injury. So the glucocorticoids try to limit the inflammatory responses so that they don't become damaging themselves. White blood cells can fight infection, but at the same time, they produce chemicals that can actually damage the body. So the glucocorticoids are sort of trying to put a check on the immune system so that it doesn't get out of hand. Okay. However, one thing about the glucocorticoids is they can actually interfere with wound healing and increase your risk of infection and even some forms of cancers. You probably have been told that stress can cause you to get sick, and believe it or not, there is something to that. If you are under a lot of stress for a long period of time, it can weaken your immune system and can make you more susceptible to colds and some of the acute illnesses, because it can drop your white blood cell count. So when the old folks tell you that stress can cause you to get sick and more susceptible to colds and stuff, there is some truth to that. And we use glucocorticoids medicinally to treat inflammatory disorders. Perhaps you or someone you know has gotten a cortisone shot. Cortisone is a steroid. It's a steroid hormone, and it decreases inflammation, so it's used in pain management. People who have rheumatoid arthritis, which is a autoimmune disease where the immune system is attacking one's joints. Cortisone is used to decrease pain and inflammation and to decrease the amount of damage caused to joints by the immune system. Everyone's probably familiar with hydrocortisone. You put that on topically on your skin to reduce irritation associated with allergies. And believe it or not, glucocorticoids are used to prevent rejection of organ transplant recipients. Just to sort of summarize the production of these of aldosterone in these glucocorticoids, right? Remember, stress can impacts the hypothalamus, causing the hypothalamus to release hormones that cause the anterior pituitary gland to release adrenal corticotropic hormone, and then the adrenal corticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex, causing the release of these glucocorticoids. The last steroid I'm going to talk about are the androgens. And androgens are male sex hormones. In both males and females, the adrenal cortex produces these androgens. So both men and women can sort of get in touch with their male side, right? Because both men and women produce these male sex hormones. What impacts do they have? Well, these androgens do stimulate the production of axillary hair, that's hair under your arms and in the pubic regions during puberty. After puberty, the androgen level induced by the adrenal cortex are insignificant. I mean, the testes pretty much take over, and they're producing 98% or more of the androgens in the body. So in males, after puberty, the contribution by the cortex is minimal. Right? In females, however, since really that's the main source of male sex hormones in females, it does have an impact on libido or sex drive. Also in women, a percentage of the androgens are actually converted to estrogens. And so in post-menopause, the adrenal cortex is the only source of estrogen in females. And I just want to mention that ACTH does stimulate the production of androgens, not to the level that it does the aldosterone and the glucocorticoids, but it does have an impact on release of these androgens by the adrenal cortex. Okay, so just summarize, the corticosteroids that are released by the adrenal cortex include the mineralocorticoids, which regulate sodium, potassium, and water levels in the blood, and the main hormone is aldosterone. And the glucocorticoids, cortisone and cortisol, with the main hormone being the cortisol, and the sex hormones, specifically the androgens. All of these are steroids, so they all work directly on the DNA of their target cells and tissues. Alrighty, so we're going to move now to our last hormones of the anterior pituitary gland, and they are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And these hormones target the gonads, the testes and ovaries, so they're also referred to as gonadotropins. All right, let's jump in here. So the gonadotropic hormones are released from the anterior pituitary gland in response to hormones from the hypothalamus. They're called gonadotropin releasing factors. You don't have to know that. All right, I put it in there just for completion. But all you have to know is there are hormones released by the hypothalamus that cause these hormones to be released from the anterior pituitary gland. Why are these gonadotropic hormones important? Well, in a juvenile, they are important for the growth and maturation of the testes and ovaries. If there is insufficient release of these gonadotropic hormones in juveniles, the gonads, the genitalia, may not sexually mature. In an adult, these gonadotropic hormones are important to maintain the function of these gonads after they are fully developed. So they're important in juveniles for the proper development of the gonads, and then in adults for them to continue to function normally. These gonadotropins are necessary. So if there's hyposecretion, then one could lose gonadal function in adults. In fact, you can actually see atrophy where they shrink or become smaller. Okay, let's look at, we have one more minute, so I'm going to talk about follicle stimulating hormone, and I'll stop there. Follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, in women targets the ovary, and as the name implies, it stimulates the development of ovarian follicles. Well, what is an ovarian follicle? Well, I want you to think of the process of a ovum maturing, sort of like an apple ripening and then falling from the tree. Falling from the tree would be when it's ovulated. An ovum goes through this process, which is called ripening, that precedes ovulation. That ripening process is stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone. Without follicle stimulating hormone, that process does not occur. In a prepubescent female, there's no ovulation because there's not sufficient follicle stimulating hormone for follicular development. Okay, now I want to make sure it's understood. I am not saying follicle stimulating hormone is responsible for ovulation. I'm not. It's responsible for the ripening process that occurs prior to ovulation. To relate it to an apple falling from a tree, follicle stimulating hormone would be responsible for the apple growing bigger and turning from green to red before it falls off the tree. Also, as this follicle develops, it produces more and more estrogen. So follicle stimulating hormone not only stimulates the ripening of this follicle, it also causes the production of estrogen by that follicle and by the ovary. In men, follicle stimulating hormone causes the production of sperm. Prior to puberty, in the testes, we have what are called daughter A cells. They're stem cells, okay? And daughter A cells just give rise to more daughter A cells. Then puberty comes along, and you get this increase in follicle stimulating hormone production, and it causes these A cells to, some of them, to become B cells. And those daughter B cells go through a process where they become sperm cells. And again, this is why before puberty, no sperm. After puberty, you get the production of sperm. It's all about this follicle stimulating hormone causing some of these stem cells to become spermatozoa. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and open up the floor for any questions you may have. Again, I want to remind you that you have a pre-lab that is due tonight at midnight, and you have a quiz, a lab quiz that is due tonight at midnight as well. Thank you, everyone. I'll be here for at least 10 more minutes to answer any questions that you may have. Sorry about that. I accidentally exited. My apologies. Okay, let's see here. Question, am I getting questions from the practice practical directly from the, wait a minute, am I getting questions from the practice practical and then putting them on the practical? No and yes. And what do I mean by that? I do not intentionally, when I made out the practical, take them from the practice practical. Just like the first practical. There wasn't an intent to do that, but I can tell you that there's always some of the same questions. I randomly, well, I randomly choose a representative sample to make the real practical, and I do the same thing for the practice practical. And are there going to be some overlap? Sure. There are going to be some questions I ask on the practice practical that are going to be on the real practical, but it's incidental. It's not done purposefully. So in other words, you can't like know everything on the practice practical and then assume that, well, that means I'm good for the real practical. Okay. You need to know everything that's on your study guides because you don't know what 50 questions I'm going to choose from that study guide. I am meeting specifically with a student at 2:30. So they're not my quote unquote normal office hours. If you would like to meet, however, we could meet in another time. We could meet later this afternoon, or I'm not even opposed to a meeting on the weekend. What are your needs? Did you show up also for office hours and I wasn't there? Are the images in the practical the same exactly? I'm looking at like what view of the leg I'm seeing. In short, no. No, they're not. Well, some of them will be, some of them won't be. I tried to make it as obvious as possible, but they're not always the same. Demi, is there a question you want to ask privately? Tropic hormones of the anterior pituitary gland are all those other than prolactin and growth hormone. So, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, TSH, sorry, not TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, yes. Uh, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, I can send you that again. That is not a problem. What's the practical study guide? No, so what I was referring to is your study guides for lab. Your study guides for lab, um, that includes everything that I could ask you on a practical. So what I tell students is make sure you know everything on it. So Silka, ACTH stimulates the release of aldosterone, the glucocorticoids, and the sex hormones. ACTH is a tropic hormone because it targets the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone, glucocorticoids, and sex hormones are not tropic hormones, but ACTH is. Let's see here. See if I can keep the questions coming. I'm trying to multitask, but keep the questions coming. I'm not ignoring you. I wish you the best of luck. I bought them earlier this week. It'll be fine. Just maintain your social distancing, wash your hands. If you go to Woodman's, they put plexiglass up between the clients and the point of sale person, or of course you can always use the self checkouts. The only issue with that is you get behind people that like are slower than molasses in January, and then you're like sitting there forever. But it can be somewhat frustrating, but it's an imperfect world. All right, Debbie, I am working on attaching this right now and sending it to you before I forget. All right, I just sent it, so make sure that you got it. Probably heard the little ding saying that I sent it. You too. Everybody have a great weekend. Lauren, Silka, any questions? Anything we need to talk about? Ugh, probably not. At least not during this class. Now, certainly, let's say like next semester, if we are back on campus, which I would expect that we would be, at least to a limited amount, we could always arrange, if you're really interested, arranging to go see the cadavers. So even if we don't do it within the scope of the class, I could, if a student really a student's really interested in human anatomy and physiology, and you want to see the cadavers, I have no problem just taking you to see them once we get the all clear to get back on campus. Okay. You as well. All right, it's 12:32 and I've got a meeting at 1 o'clock. I need to cook something for the kids and cook something for myself. So if there are no questions, I am going to sign off and say have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.